Welcome to the Contemporary Music Centre's Salon, our third episode for this new online series across the summer months. Thanks for joining us. And for this episode, it's a celebration of the solo voice and recent repertoire written by composers from Ireland for our featured performer for this salon, singer Michelle O'Rourke. And Michelle is joining us to discuss the works. And we're also joined by the three composers whose works feature in the salon. Anna Murray joining us from Japan, where she's currently living and studying. Andrew Hamilton enjoying current success with his new release on the Ergodos label, that release Joy. And speaking of that label, joining us is its co-founder, composer Garrett Sholdice. And we'll hear three works by Anna, Andrew and Garrett in the course of this salon performed by Michelle. We're really looking forward to hearing Michelle's performances and to talking about the works, and of course why texts are chosen for certain works, and about collaboration and these wonderful performances by Michelle, very intimate performances of these three works. Michelle, I'd like to start with Anna's work with Lit, because I have very clear memories of that work when it was a work in progress, because it was performed, the work in progress was performed and discussed as part of CMC's Culture Night back in 2005. So Michelle, how did this collaboration all start?
Like any good collaboration, it started with a conversation. And we were hosted by the CMC, I think, for Culture Night in 2015, where Anna and I had been exploring some ideas together. But that conversation had started a couple of years prior. And like any good conversation, it starts when you meet someone and you think, we can have a conversation and try to understand what the other person means, and then try and communicate something through a piece or through a conversation that you then present to the public. Anna, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. We had worked together in a number of projects in a different context, and through that had started this conversation going, and really found, I think, that we had something to explore. So it was really great to be able to start that collaboration in 2015. And since then, we've worked on a number of pieces that kind of came together into Lit 2 years ago.
Yeah, and we were hosted twice, I think, by the CMC, isn't that right? And so thanks for that. It was a fostering space for the conversation to be presented. And also for those CMC salons, there's always quite a nice, quick production line. So you have the conversation, you work a little bit more, and then it's time to show. And often when you're writing music, I think arriving at that point of presentation is slower. And so having that kind of accelerated process is often quite nice in a collaborative conversation, I think. So thanks.
Yeah, I think audiences enjoy when they, especially when they come in to the building on Culture Night, they very much enjoy hearing about the process, about how works are created, how composers and performers collaborate. But you're talking about, the gestation of the project and the conversation happening, sort of previous years to when we even saw it at that point on Culture Night. And so that leads me to kind of the text, Anna. I mean, what really drew you to this poem by the American poet Robert Fritterman? Because it's not a setting. This work is not a setting of the poem. It's, I suppose, based on it, or a response to ideas in the poem.
Yeah, I would agree. It's not quite a setting. It takes extracts of the poem, but the poem itself is extracts of various texts that use the word light or refer to light. So it's what drew me to it initially was actually the look of the poem. It was the visual aspect of the poem, which on the page, because it has taken its sources from science textbooks, from poetry, from all sorts of different sources, and he recreated how those appeared on their pages into one kind of collage of text. So it was that visual aspect of different types of text in different places, and how science text interacted with poetic text or imagistic text that really drew me to it in the first place. Especially with the theme of light and shadow, it had an inherent sort of image of light and shadow on the page, which really appealed to me.
Michelle, for you as a performer, there are lots of different vocal techniques at play in this work? I mean, you speak, you have some, I think, overtone singing at some point as well.
I think that's, yeah, it's not notated, but that's kind of the inflection of the text, actually. And just Anna, it's a really beautiful graphic score. And it gives, it's graphic score is kind of a reductionist way of describing it, but it gives a lot of color and texture. And Anna urged me to really find how I could interpret how she has made these marks on the page, and how I can find expressions for those in my voice in terms of shaping a melodic line, but not only shaping the melody and giving the text, but finding vocal color and depth and emotional space for those to really thrive. And for a composer to give you that space is great. It's like really a playground. It's so enjoyable. And so when you really climb into it then without, because there's a whole other school of notation where you get something that's very specific, a set of overtones, and 3 lines of notation where you must sing these things at specific times. And there's an exhilaration to that kind of music, but in this kind of music there's another kind of exhilaration because you're being given that open playground, and then you often find things that you might not find in a more specifically notated score. And so it's very playful and very invitational and very joyous to climb into that. And then it's also informed by the conversation that Anna and I have been having, and so I understand things about her aesthetic and her interests, and all of that informs how you play then.
Well, let's climb in to that vocal playground now as we hear this beautiful performance from yourself, Michelle, of Anna Murray's work for voice and electronics, Lit.
Each section outlined below is an independent treatise on a limited aspect of light and colour. Each independent aspect treatise below of colour. Each treatise is on an light of independent colour. Section limited aspect outlined below light is on an each. Understanding how and when a rainbow appears is tied to understanding how light travels. student lamp. Sapphire light, the light of a student lamp. Sapphire light. The red panel, the third color of the spectrum represents the light of poetry. To the intelligence fastened by the senses, you are lost in a world of sunlight where nothing is amiss. To the intelligence fastened by the senses, you are lost in a world of sunlight where nothing is amiss. To the intelligence fastened by the senses, you are lost in a world of sunlight where nothing is amiss. To the intelligence fastened by the senses, you are lost in a world of sunlight where nothing is amiss. To the intelligence fastened by the senses, you are lost in a world of sunlight where nothing is amiss. To the intelligence fastened by the senses, you are lost in a world of sunlight where nothing is amiss. Stand per minute for up to 'Perpetual.'
Michelle O'Rourke performing Anna Marie's Lit for voice and electronics. Just to pick up on the electronics part, Anna, how is that weaved into the work?
The electronics in Lit are in two parts. So there's a live electronic part and a pre-recorded part. And that was important for two reasons, because first, the piece is intended to be quite free. So Michelle can jump throughout the score as she wants. And using the live electronics, which she can kind of play with, you know, she understands it quite well at this stage after all these years of working together. So she knows how it will respond. So in a live performance, she can kind of jump around and explore and create sound and create an atmosphere around a piece that will adapt to a different performance setting. But then also under it, just to make sure that there is a kind of a basis for her to work on, there is this this tape part, this pre-recorded part, which is based on samples of her singing to give a pitch base underneath it so that she has something to bounce off.
Well, I certainly think that you have created an atmosphere, Michelle, in the recording that we have that we've just enjoyed, and of course, creating an atmosphere in these times is quite difficult. You know, you're creating it without an audience in the room, and do you find that a challenge? Have you found that a challenge?
Well, intimacy is the word, because I recorded those in my bedroom with our standing desk from IKEA and my mic that's about 10 years old. And luckily I got some nice light coming through the window as I was doing it, which made everything a little bit sparkly. But it is hard without an audience, but there's also, I think, a great richness in just spending time by yourself in that score and trusting that the world that you understand with the composer is a safe shared space and that your interpretation is valid and communicable, even without the transaction with the audience.
And knowing that, you know, there is going to be an audience for it in a different context.
Yeah, absolutely. That's still effort and extroversion in communication.
Yeah.
And hopefully that speaks, even though they're intimate.
Andrew, coming to you, the ladies have talked about their ongoing collaboration over many years, and knowing you and knowing Michelle, you know, speaking to you over the last few years about leading towards your new release, Joy, which features works where you yourself perform for violin, on violin and with your voice. And I think I'm right in saying that in that solo album where you're also performing, you enlisted some help from Michelle on the voice training.
That's right. Yeah, I was lucky enough to have a Arts Council bursary to pay for lessons with Michelle when I started recording. Yeah, working up to the recording of that album. But I've known Michelle for, I think, a few more years longer than that, because she was the first person to sing my piece of music for People Who Like Art. So I trusted her already. So that's why I was able to let her hear my singing.
Yeah, that's a word we actually haven't come to, but it's so key, isn't it? The trust, as you mentioned, Michelle, that that the performer and the composer are kind of coming to things from a similar aesthetic, similar kind of priorities, and with this work, Andrew O'Rourke, I mean, Michelle's name is the title of the piece, and different texts throughout the movements as well. We'll come to that. But how collaborative was this work, O'Rourke?
I would say very collaborative. I think the first movement, I went around to Michelle and Garrett's flat in Berlin when we were all living in Berlin at the same time, and I just said to her, just make some sounds that you like making, and I just wrote down what they were, and then I went away and wrote the piece. It wasn't like a very long conversation. I think we'd got to a stage by that point anyway where we didn't have to have long, deep discussions.
I remember it being quite a raucous moment, though. And I think that because the O'Rourke is a 4-movement cycle, and Yvonne's referring to the first movement, and in that first movement, a lot of those gestures landed, I think, and they are quite, hysterical almost. Like, I hate that word, but that's the best word for it. Like, they're hyper, and that's really fun and challenging, but fun.
So it was definitely completely tailored to Michelle. I wasn't thinking about anyone else ever singing it. So it was like completely handmade, like a handmade dress or something just for Michelle. It's a nice way to work. Yeah.
But I think also if a composer, and if you as a performer have a conversation of that kind with a composer, if you think about the fashion industry, if you get real couture, then we all want it. Because we see how well it fits, and once it fits the first person, then it telescopes that work into the world. So if you can work really hard to fit it on you and to communicate inside of it, then it's so easy for someone else to pick up. And so I really enjoy that process of making things fit.
It's a work that stands out in my memory, actually, because the premiere of the full work was given at a New Music Dublin concert in 2016, I think. And there was a kind of an electrifying feeling in the audience. As you say, the first movement is slightly hilarious in parts, and then the second movements are more, second and third movement, which we're going to hear in the salon, more reflective, more atmospheric. And I felt, being in the audience, that the audience really engaged with that work, thanks to your wonderful writing, Andrew, and to your really engaging performance, Michelle. So tell us about these movements we're going to hear in terms of the text, Andrew, the second and third movements.
I was actually thinking of the past week that the actual text for this piece, the 4 movements, it's a very, very serious work. It's about dealing with, in essence, dealing with dying, And I was trying to think, why on earth did I do that? And I was thinking, well, with Michelle, we have such a close friendship that I didn't feel afraid to set such serious, deep text, because I knew it goes back to the trust that I trusted her in every level. So it was sort of liberated me to be able to set these sort of texts for the first time, I think. So the first movement is a tombstone about death, and the second movement refers to the text really in the fourth movement, which is a setting of the Adita Pariyaya Sutta, which is a text that the Buddha gave about liberating yourself from sense desires. And then the third movement is a setting of Teresa of Avila, about dying before you die. So it sounds crazy, but I'm a fan of Teresa of Avila and also St. John of the Cross. I really loved those two Spanish mystics. So I felt it was a liberation to be able to set these type of texts, and I don't think I would have been able to have done it unless it was, with Michelle.
The text of the third movement feels really insightful at the moment. So it's Teresa of Avila, as Andrew said, and it's we die before we die, so that when we die, we don't die. And at the moment we're living this strange, C19 life where for many performers, composers, musicians, it's kind of a half-life, and there's this sort of reaching out into the world and pulling back into yourself. And in the writing of the setting of that text, there's a lot of dynamic elasticity. And there's a lot of propulsion in it as well. And so I really enjoyed preparing it for this. And I would urge people to listen to it as a work in progress. I'm working towards recording it in the autumn with funding from Fingal County Council, who've generously funded a recording of it. And it's not perfect. And I'm a fan of putting things out into the world, especially contemporary music, when it's not perfect, because it's never perfect. And there's the moment of performance where you find things in it that you don't find until that moment, and then you can't progress beyond that unless you go through that. And so thanks Fingal County Council for the funding. They're great. And thanks for the CMC for the opportunity to have this performance platform for this in the middle of a difficult moment.
I also want to maybe extend the third movement as well. So I think it's exciting to be able to just be open about this process. That thing, I think in contemporary music, a lot of people only get one performance and then it's never done again. So for me, I like to revise things, and after hearing the performer go through it. And then just one other thing, I think the whole piece for me, I sort of wrote it to myself. It's a way of like lecturing myself to prepare myself for the reality of life, to try and use life more wisely. So I in a way, the piece is very personal to me. It's like telling myself to wake up a bit, which that's definitely a work in progress.
I think it's a work in progress for many of us, Andrew. Let's hear the second and third movement as they are at the moment before they're revised in this work, O'Rourke, by Andrew Hamilton, performed by Michelle O'Rourke.
All this
die before that. When we die, we don't die before we die. So that when we die, we don't die. We die before we die. So that when we die, we prepare. Don't die before we die. So that when we die, we don't die before we die. So that when we die, we die. We don't die, we die before we die. So that when we die, we don't die. So that when we die, we don't die. We die before we die. So that when we die, we don't die. We so that when we die, we don't die. So that when we don't die, we don't die before we die. So that when we die, we don't die. We die before we die. So that when we die, we don't die before we die. So we don't die before we die. So that we
The second and third movements from Andrew Hamilton's O'Rourke, written for and performed there by Michelle O'Rourke, and we look forward to hearing the revised version as well later in the year, and of course the recording, Michelle, which will be great to have. And I suppose, you know, it's really wonderful to hear, to have the kind of luxury and pleasure of hearing these works for solo voice, you know, and you do think when you approach and you hear works for solo voice or for our solo instrumental works, you know, is this a challenge for the composer to, you know, have so much invest the time into, you know, creating interesting musical interest within one line of music? If you know what I mean, and we think of the Bach violin partitas and works like that, and the cello suites. Garrett, coming to you, is that something that you know, you think is a challenge for the composer? You know, it's a solo voice or a work for instrument, solo instrumental work. You know, this challenge of just the one line of music, no polyphony, no harmony.
Yeah, it's super challenging, and of course, you mentioned the Bach violin sonatas and partitas, and there the counterpoint is kind of an illusion. He creates this illusion of actually of multiple voices and multiple strands. Andrew does this too, I think, also in our work in a way that that's very it's a different style, it's a different tone. But I think it's essentially the same technique, and it's utterly extraordinary in both regards. I think the way I do it is much less sophisticated, but I am still, I think, trying to create a sort of a counterpoint or dialogue of points. In this case, in the case of this music that we're going to hear, points within a mode. So I'm usually working with a kind of a fairly contained diatonic collection, and these little points that I'm trying to make sort of light up on the map, and kind of draw lines between these points. I think I do it in a very simplistic way, but
I think you're underselling yourself. And for me, the modal element of it creates this beautiful early music atmosphere. I mean, which I'm a big fan of early music. I know you are too, and Baroque music. I think you really create this kind of link. You're talking about different points. I think you create this link between this point now and the kind of resonance that I feel when I listen to it of early music. So I think it's very successful in I suppose creating some kind of a beautiful musical TARDIS between the two, for want of a better word. But just to come to the texts, they're by Walt Whitman. And I was interested when I read about the work, though, that again, it arose from a collaborative project with Michelle and a dancer, Maya Carroll, and Roy Carroll, the sound artist and composer, again, when you were living in Berlin.
That's right, yeah. So maybe about 8 years ago, I had done what I called a chamber opera, which was working with text by Baudelaire. And although there are some difficulties with that work, which are all my fault, I felt very drawn to working in a kind of similar area, which for me, I think was sort of like a theatrical situation, a kind of a very austere theatrical situation. And I really wanted to work again with Michelle. We have a very long collaboration. I mean, we're together. We're for 17 years, married for the last 10 years. I've been working together a lot. I wanted to work again with her, and in Berlin, yeah, I'm very drawn to the work of this choreographer, dancer, Maya Carroll, and her partner Roy Carroll, sound artist, as you say. So we worked in Berlin in the summer of 2014. We started to do some workshops, and I sort of fed, sort of almost like every day, I was sort of writing these fragments, vocal fragments, that I was feeding into this process. Text by Walt Whitman from Song of Myself, which is a work I've loved for a very long time. Yeah, it was just very rich. We never ended up mounting anything, but the process was very rich, and I learned so much from it. I left all the music in a kind of a semi-formed state. Some things were more formed, some things not so much. I just sort of left it there. And over the years, Michelle has sort of drawn from it in various different contexts. And then more recently, I thought maybe there's a sort of a 3-song suite there, a little mini cycle perhaps. And so for this salon, Michelle has performed what I think possibly could be the first and third songs in a little cycle. I'm not sure. But the texts, the texts are also dealing with existence and the sort of I suppose a very particular perspective on existence. The first text, I have heard what the talkers were talking, the talk of the beginning and the end, but I do not talk of the beginning and the end. This is, I think, Whitman saying, well, I've heard all this talk of division, of concrete division into beginning and end, but everything is a continuum. There is no beginning and there is no end. And in the other text, I am not an earth or the adjunct of an earth. I am the mate and companion of all people. I think this is also referring to a kind of a continuum. He says earlier in that fragment, to be born and to die are equally lucky. It's all part of the one cycle. He says, I am not contained between my hat and my boots. I am not a fixed physicality. I am not an earth. I see the continuum and I celebrate my presence in it. And I think for him that meant celebrating this moment only, right now, the present. Yeah.
I think Evonne is bang on when she talks about the TARDIS between Garrett's music and Baroque music. Obviously, he's just outed us, we're fully married. You know, that has its own quality when you work together and you have that relationship behind the scenes. But Garrett's been in a room in Berlin with me practicing Bach, practicing Handel. He's seen me through like a master's in early music and performances through that. And so he understands how my voice operates in that realm. And yeah, I can really feel that when he writes for me. And also there's something in these Whitman settings, just as he's been talking about the universality, the specificity of being. And in Baroque music, I feel like that there's also that local and global connection going on all the time. And so it's about weaving your web of understanding in these pieces, which is a total pleasure when your husband throws you a score. It's lovely.
That's so nice to hear. And I just, what you're saying there about the local and the global, you know, so relevant to us all at the moment in the current situation. Let's hear these two beautiful Whitman songs and these settings of Whitman poems as Garrett has described, by Garrett Sholdice, performed by Michelle O'Rourke.
I have heard what the talkers were talking, the talk of the beginning and the
Michelle O'Rourke with 2 Whitman songs by Garrett Sholdice. I have heard what the talkers were talking, and I am not an earth nor an adjunct of an earth. My huge and sincere thanks to all of you for joining us on today's episode of The Salon, to Michelle O'Rourke for your wonderful performances of these 3 works and taking the time to share those works with us and your thoughts on those works, to Andrew, to Anna and to Garrett for the insights to your pieces. It's always a huge joy and a privilege to hear composers talk about their work, and I think just so important, and for us at the moment a huge joy because we can't meet up with you in person as often as we would like to in 19 Fishamble Street or around the country. So all best wishes to Andrew, Anna and Garrett and Michelle, and we'll be back next week for the 4th episode of the CMC Online Salon, which will feature works for solo flute performed by Miriam Catcher. Stay with us for that next week, and all the details will be on cmc.ie and across our social media channels.